Redeemer Queens Park exists to help connect Jesus to people, people to community, and community to mission. And I just want to welcome you to another Bible talk in the Redeemer Queens Park community. We're starting a new collection of talks today in the book of Exodus. And the book of Exodus is the story of God's people. Let's get right into it. Just the other day, I was scrolling on my phone. I actually discovered in my photo apps the memory from 13 years ago was a memory of me in India with a group of friends. And while I was in India, I was actually sharing the gospel with someone, and I came to see that the Hindu word, in the actual grammar there, in Tamil, for salvation was actually different than the English word. And I was trying to explain salvation. I was trying to illustrate what salvation by grace through faith in Jesus actually meant. And it just really wasn't coming across. And it actually occurred to me, the way the Bible explains salvation isn't really through a simple definition, but it's more through stories. And that's really what we have in the book of Exodus. We have the story of God saving people. So let's consider what this story is about. Interestingly, the story of the book of Exodus begins with the Hebrew word for and, A-N-D. And that actually takes us back into the Genesis story. So let's go back into Genesis for just a few moments and have a think about what the story of Genesis is about, because that's the story of the book of Exodus. When you think about the story of Genesis, the basic storyline is this: God had promised to make Abraham a mighty nation. His descendants would be a mighty nation, and he would give them a land, and through these things, through a people and a land, the world would be blessed. But all throughout the book of Genesis, it looks like God's promise to Abraham actually isn't going to happen. Abraham and his descendants are sterile, they can't have kids, and when they finally have families, they are dysfunctional on every level. There's wife swapping, there's infighting, there's guys with anger issues. It's just a mess, to be honest with you. Towards the end of Genesis, we see more problems. Jacob had 12 sons, but more problems came about with them. There was a famine in the land. They were all about to starve to death. And the 12 sons actually sell off one of their brothers, Joseph, into slavery. Now, Joseph, through a wild story, is preserved by the grace of God, and he is raised up to be the vice premier of Egypt. He actually saves not only his family, and he not only keeps God's promises alive, but he actually saves the entire nation. And that's how Genesis ends. You've got God's promise looming in the background. You can hear God. I'm going to make Abraham a great nation. I'm going to really bless his descendants. But in actuality, the descendants of Abraham are a small, dysfunctional band of brothers living in someone else's land. So here's how the book of Exodus begins. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation had died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly. They increased in numbers and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Now, the good news is that part of God's promise to Abraham is fulfilled. Old, sterile Abraham has his great nation. But consider how Exodus continues. There are just more and more problems and obstacles to God's promise being fulfilled. Check it out from verses 8 through 12 that you can see right here. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came into power, and he gets really insecure as he looks at this nation living within his land, and he has an idea for going after them with some population control. So in verses 15 to 22, this new Pharaoh says, we need a new plan. We have to control the population here because they keep growing. So in a gross act of terror, this Pharaoh, he calls for all the male babies who are born to be killed. He gets the midwives together and he says, when you're delivering a baby, if it's a girl, then that's going to be okay. But if it's a boy, then go ahead and kill it. The midwives, miraculously, they say to themselves, we're not going to do that. We're not going to obey this earthly Pharaoh. We're going to obey God in heaven. We're not going to honor God, and we're not going to kill babies. This is essentially the testimony of these Hebrew midwife women. Now, the bottom line here is that Pharaoh's plans were thwarted. God's nation kept growing, even though they were in bitter slavery, even though they were severely tormented. So here's the first truth, and I only have 3 that I want to share with you today. The first truth I want to share with you is this. The Exodus story is incredibly relevant for today. The first truth is God is saving a people from the bondage of sin and to the freedom of being able to serve Him. That's what Exodus is all about. It's salvation by way of an epic story. Pharaoh represents a false god to which Israel is dutifully enslaved. The Exodus story is about God saving a people from this false god and giving people the freedom to serve Him. The book of Exodus is arranged to prove this very point. The first 17 chapters of Exodus is about God drawing this people out of slavery, and the rest of the book is about God drawing this people into relationship with Himself. God doesn't just save people from something, God saves people to something, namely a relationship with Himself. So this chapter reveals that what service to any other god is actually like. Have a look at verses 13 and 14, and you'll see a picture of slavery. Look at the emphasis. They worked, they labored, they worked, they labored, they worked. This sevenfold emphasis on the monotonous labor they had to go through is a picture of what slavery is like. And it's a picture of the salvation that God brings when He brings us out of this. So Exodus chapters 1 and 2 tell us about the preparation for salvation. Before there can be a great deliverance, there must be a great slavery. And Exodus shows us God's plan to save a people from false gods and give them true freedom. Now chapter 2 begins the story of Moses. The story of Moses begins right here in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, I guess that is 3-month-olds, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch, and she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds in the bank of the Nile. Now this one Hebrew mother placed her son in an Hebrew ark, and she put him in the water, and the water was going to be his way of salvation. And one of Pharaoh's 65 daughters is out bathing in the Nile one day, and she sees this basket just over there in the reeds. She tells one of her servants to go and get it and retrieve it, and Pharaoh's daughter finds favor with this child. This child is going to be named Moses. She looks off to the side, and she actually sees Moses' big sister standing not far away, who's actually watching baby Moses floating on the Nile. She calls her over. She says, "Do you know anyone that can help take care of this?" She's like, "Yeah, I do have a woman in mind." And Moses' mama gets to raise him for a number of years before he goes back to be a full-fledged member in Pharaoh's house. So in chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, we see Moses grew up. We see he's grown up, and he sees 2 of his people fighting one day, and tragically, Moses whacks a guy in the head, buries him in the sand, and he flees to a place called Midian. The father of a house in Midian actually comes to Moses, and Moses is actually able to start a new lifestyle. Whereas he had this time of training in Egypt, now he's going to learn what it means to be a humble shepherd. But meanwhile, back in Egypt, Exodus 2, 23 to 25, the Israelites groaned in their slavery, and God heard, and God remembered, and God looked, and God had concern. The second point I want you to see today is this: God is clearly working, even when He seems most hidden in our lives. When we read Exodus chapter 2, we start asking the question, where is God? God's people are wondering, does He even remember us? Is He going to keep this promise? But God is at work in the Exodus story, especially in those moments where it looks like He's nowhere to be found. And friend, the same is true for your life and mine. Look into the Exodus story and find strength and hope and life. You see, God used their slavery to form them and to multiply them as a nation. When you think about it, they were oppressed, but they were physically together. Their joint suffering gave them a national solidarity, and perhaps it's even without the suffering and the slavery that they would have simply been absorbed into Egyptian society and life. This is true. Christianity is like a nail. The harder you strike it, the deeper you drive it. Notice this: God also thwarted Pharaoh's evil decree to kill all male children by causing Moses to be adopted by one of his own daughters. It's absolutely amazing. As a son of Pharaoh, Moses now received the military leadership that he needed. He was gaining the necessary skills to lead millions of Israelites. And the more God's kingdom is opposed, the faster God's kingdom grows. You see God at work in the details of a basket floating on water. Imagine watching this with a drone, watching high above this little basket floating mercilessly on top of the Nile River. No crocodile comes along and eats it. It's not swept away into the delta of the Nile and taken off. It doesn't land on just any bank, and it's not discovered by just any person. God in heaven is sovereign over every detail. God is even at work through Moses' stupidity. Moses is doing everything he can to help people, but he kills somebody, he runs away to Midian, and God is at work in all the details of Moses' life, because God enrolled Moses in the leadership school of Egypt, and then God transferred him to the desert training plan when the time was right. The point is that God will use all of these things, especially the bad things, even our stupid mistakes, and he works them for his own glory. Just like Paul would say later in Romans chapter 8, verses 28 to 32. In all things, God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. So friend, the unfair and unjust action of other people cannot thwart God's plan for your life. Your own stupidity, your own sin, your own mistakes, they cannot keep you from God's best. Because the hero of the Exodus story, it isn't Moses, it's God through and through. And that's the third and final truth I want to share with you. Very simply, God draws us out to draw us in. God is always in the process, from Genesis to Revelation, and especially in the book of Exodus, of drawing a people out, of creating a people for himself, who he will reveal his glory to, and he will reveal his glory through that people to the rest of the world. God saves a people in our weakness, not because of our strength. He delivers us from the worship of other gods and to the worship of him, the one true living God. Exodus shows us the gospel. It's God's acceptance that comes first, and then it's our life change and transformation that comes second. Gospel change is not towards security. Gospel change comes from security. God draws us out in order to draw us into a relationship with himself. As we study the book of Exodus in the weeks ahead, we're going to talk a lot about this man named Moses, but we're going to talk even more about a man named Jesus. Because Jesus was born at a time when another evil king said it's time to kill all the babies. Jesus too was born in a time where he would have his own wilderness wanderings, but he had the Spirit of God in his life to sustain him all the way through. Jesus was rejected by his people that he came to lead, draw out, and save. In Luke chapter 9, verse 31, we see the transfiguration of Jesus. And we see that Moses actually appears in the midst. And we see in this second Exodus, two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor talking with Jesus. And they spoke about Jesus' soon departure, or the Greek word for this is his exodus, that he would bring about with the cross. Jesus and Moses were there in the transfiguration, and Jesus was talking about his eventual departure, how he was going to lead another people out through the water by way of the cross. All of this is about Jesus. Jesus went to the cross and died. He drew us out. And Jesus rose from the dead, and he offers us life. He draws us in. Look at this beautiful picture of salvation and think about what God could do in your life. From the promise to Abraham, to his preservation through Exodus, to his perfection in Christ. The Exodus story is the story of God's people, the story of Israel. And we today, we are God's people, drawn out of slavery to other gods, given the freedom to worship the one true living God. And we too, in our sin and in our brokenness, with the Spirit's help, we are waiting on the promised land, and God is with us.